There's a phrase that I wonder if you've heard someone use this to you before, and it goes something like this. It's what he would have wanted. It's what he would have wanted. Now keep that in your mind, as we talk about a few things. Now, in every career that you might have, there are probably some things that you either experience or do that other people that don't share your career wouldn't understand. So for those of you who are teachers in the room, I probably would not be able to understand how difficult parents can be when you are dealing with them if you're a teacher. Like if you're a teacher, you probably can only talk to another teacher or another administrator to understand how difficult parents can be. I'm one of those at this moment with a kid in elementary school. So you can't share that unless someone else has the same experience as you. Maybe, say if you were a plumber, you would probably say you would not believe the stuff, for lack of a more appropriate word, that I have to put up with in my day-to-day working life. And there is one of those things, being in pastoral ministry, that those of us who are pastors on staff have, an experience, a part of our job, that you just would not be able to understand because you haven't seen the things that we have seen. And the thing that I have in mind tonight is the thing that we as pastors get to see, which is how families behave when a funeral service is upcoming. So your experience with funerals has probably either been just whatever funerals you've attended in your life, or maybe if you had a loved one that passed, maybe you were more involved in the service in putting it together. But as pastors, we see this happen over and over and over again. And so all of our pastors on staff, Patrick Thurman, he knows how to do a funeral. He's done it over and over again. Mark Terry knows how to do a funeral. And we have just seen some things that maybe you wouldn't believe. And because of that, I'm not going to give you any specific stories of families, by the way, if that's what you were hoping I was going to do. I wouldn't do that unless I was given a good sum of money. Anyway, because of that, our church has a lot of restrictions and policies for when we do a memorial service here, that when we give them, they might seem arbitrary to a family. So like one of those restrictions is at a funeral that we do at our church, we only allow sacred music to be played. So music that is in some way related to being Christian in nature, whether it's like a hymn or a song or a worship song. We don't allow other songs. Now, does it say anything in the Bible that you're not allowed to have that? No, but it's a policy that we have in place for a reason. Another one would be this. During funeral services, we generally will not have a time where we play a slideshow with music in the background during the funeral service. And those rules might seem arbitrary, but they're really not. And the reason is simply this. We as pastors have just seen, doing this over and over again, that if we do not take charge and have control of the situation, the crazy will take charge and have control of the situation. Every time. It's what ends up happening. So it makes sense. Just imagine it. When you go to a funeral, take every dysfunctional relationship in your family, every rivalry between siblings, every crazy uncle or cousin, and they are going to want to take control of the situation if someone else does not. And so for that reason, we as pastors take charge when those things happen. But the issue, though, is this. A lot of times at these funerals, if we don't stop it from happening, what you will get is you will get a person coming in from the family and saying this, it's what she would have wanted. When really what they mean is, it's what I want. Let me do this. She would have wanted me to play my original song that I've written so everyone can pay attention to me and listen to it at the funeral. She would have wanted all 13 children to give eulogies so the funeral will last for 3.5 hours. She would have wanted me to have this valuable brooch that I will sell on the open market as soon as I get it. A lot of people will use that as an excuse to do these things. She would have wanted us to do this slideshow with unflattering pictures of her to Frank Sinatra's I Did It My Way in the background. By the way, this is a tangent about funerals here. I've seen a bunch of funerals where people want to have that song played or sung, that I Did It My Way. Now, it's a great song, by the way. Frank Sinatra is excellent. But can you imagine a more inappropriate song for a Christian funeral than saying I Did It My Way? So as the pastor, I get up there and I say, Frank is with the Lord now, and he gave his life to the Lord. And if he were standing here right now, he would say, the Lord's way is better. You need to give your life to the Lord. And then I sit down, and the next thing you hear is, I did it my way. And you're like, okay, this isn't right. Anyway, what were we talking about? I'm joking. Now, the reason I say all this is, a lot of times that phrase, this is what he would have wanted, this is what she would have wanted, is an excuse to smuggle in your own agenda and say, this is what I want. And so just as a piece of life advice, if you're ever going to use that phrase and say it's what he would have wanted, you better be sure that it's actually what that person would have wanted and not it's what I want, so give it to me right now. Now, the reason I bring all this up is to say I came across someone making that comparison this week from the book of Galatians, what we're reading, to a funeral where a person is trying to smuggle in their own agenda. And so basically what the commentator said is that the Apostle Paul's opponents have come in to these Galatian believers and said to them, it's what Jesus would have wanted, for you to follow the law and take on the ethnic markers of Israel, and so you need to do it. But really, what they meant is, this is what we want, and so you should do it because we're going to tell you it's what he would have wanted. And so what I want to do tonight is answer a question that I posed to you 2 weeks ago and did not give you an answer to, which was kind of mean of me, but I'm still glad I did it. And the question was a very simple one. Why did God give the law of Moses to the people of Israel? So if you'll remember, in previous weeks, the thing that Paul has been hammering over and over again is that the people of promise, meaning God's people, are people who believe in Jesus. So people who are descendants of Abraham by faith, those are God's people. But then afterward, the law was given. And so these ethnically Jewish people were saying, why would God have given the law if he didn't expect us to follow it? Which, by the way, is a pretty good question. So for tonight, what we're going to try and do is we're going to read about 10 verses. And this is going to be a slightly technical, teaching-heavy time together. So you'll have to stay with me. But I want to definitively answer this question for you. Why is it that God gave the law of Moses to Israel if he does not expect us to follow it right now? So you and I would assume, are not following the Jewish food laws. We're not following the Jewish calendar. So why did God give the law in the first place? So let's answer. Starting in verse 15, it says this, "Brethren, I speak in terms of human relations. Even though it is only a man's covenant, yet when it has been ratified, no one sets it aside or adds conditions to it. Now the promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed. He does not say, and to seeds, as referring to many, but rather to one, and to your seed, that is Christ." If you'll remember, last week, the initial move that Paul made, sorry, not last week, 2 weeks ago, the move that Paul made was he said, we are children not of the law of Moses, but of the promises that God made to Abraham. Those things came first. So that's what Paul's talking about here. And let's review really quickly what those promises were to Abraham. They were very simple. The Lord told Abraham he would have many descendants, which was crazy because he was very old and so was his wife, but they did have children. It happened. The second thing is a specific plot of land that is often now referred to as the promised land, that the modern-day Israel and some of the surrounding areas. And then lastly, that the Lord would bless the nations through fulfilling these promises to Abraham. So these were the key things that God had promised to Abraham. And so now Paul tells us something in verse 16 that would change the perspective of many of the people reading it. And he said this, notice that when God gives the promise, he says it's to Abraham's seed, not seeds, plural. Now, for the people in Israel, they would have been thinking God's promises to Abraham would be fulfilled when Israel became a mighty nation in the promised land and then became the most powerful in the world, and then the world would be blessed as a result. They were always thinking in those terms, that the nation state of Israel achieving glory would be God fulfilling his plan in the world. Now, Paul undercuts that and says, I want you to notice God's promise was not about a nation state. It was about the seed that would come later. And we will read a little bit more about that in a moment. But the seed, of course, for Paul, is Jesus. Jesus is the promised faithful Israelite descendant of Abraham. So what Paul is saying is that for the entire time, God's plan was always that Jesus would be the one to come to, in the promised land, fulfill all the things that God had said and deal with the problem that all humans have, that we'll talk about in a moment. So God's promise was to Abraham's seed, Jesus, not seeds, ethnic Israel. Let's pick up in verse 17. He says this, what I'm saying is this, the law, which came 430 years later after Abraham, does not invalidate a covenant previously ratified by God, so as to nullify the promise. For if the inheritance is based on law, it is no longer based on a promise, but God has granted it to Abraham by means of a promise. So Paul's saying something very simple here. The law of Moses, given 430 years later on Mount Sinai, and a few weeks ago, we used the little GIF from History of the World where Moses comes out with the 3 stone tablets and says, I gave you these 15, and he drops 10 commandments. So God giving the law of Moses does not invalidate the initial promise that God had made to Abraham, that all of the world, all the nations would be blessed by him. So God gives that promise initially to Abraham. The law does not undercut or make obsolete those promises to Abraham anymore. Let's pick up in verse 19. Why the law then? So again, back to the question I said we were going to answer at the beginning. It was added because of transgressions, having been ordained through angels by the agency of a mediator until the seed would come to whom the promise had been made. Now, a mediator is not for one party only, whereas God is only one. Is the law then contrary to the promises of God? May it never be. For if a law had been given which was able to impart life, then righteousness would indeed have been based on law. Okay, that's a lot of words, but I think we can make this pretty simple here. Why the law? The reason that the law got given in the first place is because of sin. So keep in mind a few things. God makes promises to Abraham that he's going to have all these things happen in the future. Why did God have to pick Abraham in the first place? Because there was a problem for humans that everyone had, and that problem is sin. If we look back a little bit farther in the Bible, we find out this. The problem was indeed always sin. The problem was not that Israel was not a great nation. It's that all of humanity was alienated from God because of sin. Every single one of us. And I really love reading this. If you go back to Genesis chapter 3, it's the story of Adam and Eve in the garden. So God places them in the garden, gives them a job. He says, you can eat the fruit of any tree except for this one. And then, of course, Eve and Adam are both deceived by the serpent, and they do eat from the tree. And after that happens, God says something right away to the serpent. And I want to read these to you. It's a prophecy in verses 14 and 15. It says this, the Lord God said to the serpent, because you have done this, cursed are you more than all cattle, and more than every beast of the field. On your belly you will go, and dust you will eat all the days of your life. And I will put enmity, strife, war, between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. So what is the context that God promised things to Abraham to begin with? He promised these things to Abraham because God's plan was always to deal with sin and death from the very beginning. So if you read the story of the Bible, it's not like God had plan A, put Adam and Eve in the garden, and then, oops, that messed up. Let's recalibrate and try something different. Let's try Abraham. Oh, that didn't work either. Let's now give the law. No. Plan A was always that God would deal with the problem of sin and death. And you'll notice here, he says that he's going to do it through the seed of the woman right away. Then, when Abraham comes and God gives promises to Abraham, he says that he is going to have this seed in this promised land that will bless the entire world. God's plan A was always that he was going to send Jesus. There's no question about it. From the beginning, God was always planning that his seed would crush the head of sin and death. His heel would be bruised in the process, but he would save all of humanity from sin. That was always plan A. So he makes this promise to Abraham, and then we have this intervening time between Abraham and the right time when Jesus would come. I do want to say this. This is a full sentence to describe what's happening here. God would deal with sin, which was the problem as soon as Genesis 3 happened, through Abraham's descendants, really descendant, his seed, in the promised land to bless the entire world. So for Israel, they were thinking, God has promised us the privilege of being his people. We need to be in the promised land and in charge of it so that we can be a great nation, which was the wrong perspective. The reason that God was keeping his people together is because the one, Jesus, would come later from within God's people, would faithfully live out everything of what it means to be God's people, would die on behalf of the sins of the world and deal with the problem of sin. That was always God's answer, and that's always what happened. But the issue, though, is that Jesus obviously didn't come immediately. The Bible tells us multiple times in the Gospels that Jesus came at the fullness of time. So at just the right moment in human history, God sent Jesus. And there's a whole lot of reasons we could talk about why it was the right moment in history, but suffice it to say, the Bible makes it clear. At the fullness of time, Jesus came. Even in Jesus' ministry, there were different moments where Jesus would heal someone, and he would say, don't tell anyone. And then the gospel writers would tell us, because his time had not yet come. So Jesus would come at the fullness of time, but what happens in the meantime? Let's pick up in verse 22. But the scripture has shut up everyone under sin, so that the promise by faith in Jesus Christ might be given to those who believe. But before faith came, we were kept in custody under the law, being shut up to the faith which was later to be revealed. So Paul tells the Christians at this point, what is it that saves us from sin? It's belief in Jesus. We know this because Jesus has already come. But what he says here is that the scripture, or meaning the law, the things that God had given to Israel, kept people in custody, is the word he said, until faith could be revealed. So he gives an analogy here that the law was like a custodian, like a jailer, like a person watching over the people of Israel, protecting them for a moment. Let's keep reading, verse 24. Therefore, the law has become our tutor to lead us to Christ, so that we may be justified by faith. But now that faith has come, we are no longer under a tutor. So Paul now gives us two really helpful analogies to answer that question. Why did God give the law of Moses? Why did he specifically set Israel apart as an ethnic entity for this time period if he didn't expect all of his people to follow it for all of time? And he answers it in two ways. He says the law was given to be like a guardian. So imagine you have a kid growing up, and you as the parent are not able to be with the kid all the time, and so you hire a really strict, mean nanny to watch the child all the time to protect them from themselves, to keep them from making any bad decisions. So like right now, I have a 6-year-old and a 2-year-old and then a 1.5-month-old. So let's put the 1.5-month-old aside because she can't do anything except for eat and sleep and poop. But the two others, it is very clear that if left to their own devices, they would find every inventive way to get themselves killed if left to their own devices. They need to be watched over at all times. And so, in a lot of ways, God was saying here, the problem for not just Israel, but the whole world was sin. Sin needed to be dealt with. The time needed to be held into account until Jesus could come. So what happens in the meantime? The Lord gives Israel the law to keep them intact, keep them separated from the rest of the world, so that they would not be contaminated. Now, if you go back and read the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, the commands that God gives Israel over and over again have to do with things like this. Don't intermarry with the Canaanites around you. Do not worship the way that they worship. Do not be infiltrated by them. Were those commands for all times and all places? No. They were for Israel to preserve them and keep them together because Jesus was going to come later. Verses 24 and 25, Paul gives a second thing about the law. He says the law was also a tutor. So one, it was like a guardian, like almost in a negative way, holding the people of Israel back from doing anything stupid. But on the second thing, it was like a tutor telling them how they actually should live. So especially the moral components of the law, things like the 10 Commandments, things like worship practices, those were put in place to guide them and prepare them and make them ready for the time that God would send his faithful seed, his faithful Israelite, and so that he could deal with the sins of the world. So Paul says this: if the law by itself can't save anyone, if it only brings a curse, then why would God have even given it? And the answer is pretty simple. It was given to tide things over as a temporary measure, as a placeholder, until the fullness of everything that God intended for humanity could come in Jesus. So the law was good. It was from the Lord. There was nothing evil about it, but it was made to separate Israel, to prepare them for that time that Jesus would come to bless not just one nation state. That's small potatoes in God's eyes. It was to bless the entire world and deal with the problems of sin and death. I was thinking about a way of maybe trying to make an analogy for this week, and here's what I came up with. And if it's dumb, just forget that I even said it. But there are times where someone will have a traumatic medical thing happen to them, maybe like a cardiac arrest, heart attack or something, where afterward there is extreme damage and swelling in the brain of the person where this has happened. So this is fairly common. They'll have a heart attack, and a lot of times what the doctors will do in the immediate aftermath is that they will put the patient into an artificially induced coma. And the reason that they do this is to wait for the swelling to go down, wait for things to be right, until they can actually do the thing that they need to do to either repair the heart or repair something else. I mean, there's other times where someone needs to have a surgery and the doctor might say to you, you need to lose weight before we can actually do this surgery. You need to do something before you get there. So a lot of times, though, the doctor will give the person anesthesia, put them in an artificially induced coma, and wait for the time that they can actually solve the problem. What was happening with these Judaizers and with the Galatians, by them coming to these Gentile believers and saying, actually, you need to have your men circumcised. You need to become ethnically Jewish in order to become one of God's people. It'd be the equivalent of if a family member of the person who had just been put into an artificially induced coma had said this: doctor, thank you so much for saving my family member. I'm so grateful. And then the doctor says, okay, we're scheduling this surgery for 3 days from now when the swelling goes down. And then the family member goes, no, keep him in the coma. It's working. What you have going is working. Just leave him there. Like, how foolish would that be? And the reason you put them in the coma is so that they can be healed and wake them up. It's a temporary measure until the real solution could come. That's what the law was. The law was a temporary, good solution until God's actual answer, every promise that God had made to Israel, found their yes in Jesus when he came. And anything that we do, whether it's this specific issue, which was 2,000 years ago, of the Judaizers trying to Judaize Gentile believers, or today, people trying to tell you and I that there are extra things that we have to do to please the Lord other than belief in Jesus. Every time you do that, you're trying to put the patient back in the coma for no reason. It doesn't do anything. It only hurts. It doesn't help. And so that's the answer. The reason for the law is that God had a plan from the beginning. God's plan is that he was going to deal with the sin and death that corrupt every one of our hearts and minds and lives. He had a plan for us from the beginning. His next part of that plan was to set apart a specific set of people and give them a way to live so that from that group, the faithful one, Jesus, could come, not just for one nation, but for all the nations, for all the people of the world, where any person who believes in Jesus is a part of God's yes, is a part of God's kingdom, is a part of God's future for what he has for you and I. Now, I hope that gives you some answers to what this specific part of the text means. What does it do for us now? How do we apply this to our lives? What does Paul say this means for people, not just Galatians in the first century, but us now? And the answer to that question is something that I'm going to give you 1 week from now. I'm not going to tell you until we get there. I won't do this every time, but sometimes I just cannot resist myself. We are going to read one of the best couple of verses in the entirety of Scripture at the end of chapter 3 this next week, and it gives us the so what. If the law was given for that purpose, so what? What does it mean for us now? We will talk about it then. But the final thing that I think we have to keep hammering over and over again as we read Galatians is this. God has dealt with the problem of sin and death. The deepest issues of your life, they are dealt with in Jesus. And the only way that you can become who God made you to be, have purpose and meaning in your life, the only place those things find their answer is in Jesus. If we look for them in anything else, in any other type of pleasure, in any other type of religious system or moral code or political belief or anything else falls short. All those things is like putting the patient back into the coma again. What we need is an actual solution. We need to be transformed into something new. And the only answer for that comes in Jesus.